cut!
What makes a movie is the editing.
I've been in the business for, 37 years, I think, something like that. And I did not really realize what editing was until I was in the editing room myself.
There's magic to editing. Magic is a discovery of something new that wasn't intended, that works for the movie.
Once you start to realize that film is the sum of editing, then editing is the thing you're always looking at.
Showtime, folks.
I think great editing skill will protect a director from suicide.
First filmmakers simply photographed what interested or amused them. They held a shot until they got bored, or the film ran out.
The fathers of cinema, Edison in the United States and the Lumiere brothers in France, were very pessimistic about the future of cinema. There was probably a worldwide interest in seeing these images move, but once you'd seen somebody playing a joke with a hose, why pay money to see something that you can see for real out in the street? In fact, Auguste Lumiere went as far as to say that cinema was an invention without a future.
But Edwin Porter, one of Thomas Edison's employees, proved him wrong. Porter discovered that cutting separate shots together could create a story.
Edwin S. Porter really was the one with the Life of the American Fireman, I think, that started intercutting and creating an emotional impact in the audience by intercutting two shots that are not related to each other. One scene is going on at one place, basically the firemen rushing to a fire with their horse-drawn wagons, and the other scene is the fire, miles away. You intercut the two, and you understand psychologically and emotionally that these people's lives are in danger, and these people are coming to rescue them, and you're rooting all of a sudden for that to happen, and you're hoping they save the people. I often think about what it must have been like to be there, to create the art form as it was happening, and say, why don't we try this? That doesn't make any sense. I mean, we do it in the editing room now. We cut to something and say, well, that doesn't work. Well, imagine what they must have said in 1904.
The Great Train Robbery was Porter's next film. That's when you really begin to see the possibilities. And I'm not saying this because I'm an editor, but the invention of editing is the thing that allowed film to take off. It's the equivalent of the invention of flight. Both human-powered flight and motion picture editing were invented in the same year, and they have similar kinds of effects.
The invention of editing gave birth to a new art and a new language. A language that can transport us in the blink of an eye from the vastness of the desert to the mysteries of the human face. A cut can bridge millions of years, connecting the prehistoric past to an imaginary future. Editing can slow down time or speed it up. The timing of a cut can startle audiences.
I'm cleaning out a crooked laundry, see? Little do
Or
I know
amuse
it,
them.
But there's a dope fiend with a long knife trailing after me. I'm in great danger.
I'll never let go. I promise.
The choice and length of shots shape our response to everything we see on the screen.
And editing is why people like movies. Because in the end, wouldn't we like to edit our own lives? I think we would. I think everybody would like to take out the bad parts, take out the slow parts, and look deeper into the good parts.
The editor has to be, he's sort of the ombudsman for the audience. As an editor, you only see what is on the screen, not what was going on at the time of shooting. And that's how it's going to look to the audience. I make it a principle not to go on the set, not to see the actors out of costume, not to see anything other than the images that come to me from location.
A major Hollywood production shoots almost 200 hours of film. Unspooled, the film would stretch from LA to Vegas. An editor may work for months, even years, crafting this footage into a 2-hour movie. The finished film will contain thousands of shots, each measured in frames of 1/24th of a second.
For a writer, it's a word, all right? For a composer or a musician, it's a note, all right? For an editor and a filmmaker, it's the frames, all right? And you know, the 1 frame off or 2 frames added or 2 frames less is the difference between a sour note and a sweet note. It's the difference between clunky, clumsy crap, all right, and orgasmic rhythm.
Verna Fields made many good contributions to Jaws. We all referred to Verna Fields as Mother Cutter because she was very earthy and very maternal. She cut her films at her house, in her pool house in the San Fernando Valley, and it was a very Hamish kind of workplace. The shark didn't work as well or as often as it was supposed to work according to the screenplay.
That's the spot.
We had a contest where Verna would stop the moviola on a frame where she wanted to make the cut, and I would stop it where I wanted to make the cut. And if ever we stopped it on the same frame that had already been marked with a grease pencil X, we knew that was the right frame on certain things where we didn't agree. And all of our disagreements always happened with that darn shark. Verna was always in favor of making less to be more. And I was trying to squeeze that one more, because it took me days to get the one shot. So I'm going back to, I'm on a barge for 2 days trying to get the shark to look real. And the sad fact was the shark would only look real in 36 frames, not 38 frames. And that 2-frame difference was the difference between something really scary and something that looked like a great white floating turd.
Out of my way.
D.W. Griffith was the first great filmmaker to understand the psychological importance of editing. Working a decade after Porter, he did more than anyone else to advance the storytelling tools Porter had developed. Griffith invented and popularized techniques that established the basic grammar of film. His melodramas were the first to draw audiences into the emotional world of his characters.
He certainly was the first man to use the close-up in a big way.
This was revolutionary. It was so revolutionary that the producers, when they saw this, were aghast. They thought, you can't put this picture out like this. You can't cut to this big, ugly shot of somebody. First of all, we're paying for this actor, this actress. We want to see their whole body. We don't want to just see their face. Second of all, the audiences won't know what to respond to. They're going to be all confused. Well, the proof is in the pudding, and the reality is that the audiences were not confused at all.
Griffith brought it together in one magnificent film, Birth of a Nation, and we saw the accumulation of sort of 10 years of editing knowledge put into a movie. And all of a sudden you had not only had close-ups, but you had flashbacks, parallel action, and you had all sorts of things that he used to make the audience, his attention focused on a certain part of the frame.
D.W. Griffith established the tenets of classical film editing. And classical film editing relied on the concept of the invisible cut, in which action would always be continuous and fluid and moving.
The goal was to mask the cut so the audience wouldn't notice and could forget that they were watching a movie. Let's take another look. Notice how the gesture matches from one shot to the next? Griffith's seamless editing is still practiced today and was the dominant editing style in Hollywood movies for decades.
At last.
Look again. The cut is so smooth that it's barely noticeable.
It's all for telling the story. And all you want to do is get the person emotionally invested in the story. So it becomes this invisible craft.
We call it the invisible art. And indeed, it is. I mean, the more invisible we are, the better we're doing our job.
Unfortunately, the invisible style of editing kept editors invisible and unappreciated as well. For years, they have been the best-kept secret of the movies. The first cutters were considered hands for hire rather than creative partners in the filmmaking process. They looked at the images by holding the film up to the light. Then they would check their work by running it through a projector and making the necessary adjustments. Griffith's main cutter was Jimmy Edward Smith, who virtually lived with him at the studio, where they worked far into the night, running the film shot during the day. Later, Smith's wife Rose joined the editing team. The Smiths married during the cutting of Intolerance. For their honeymoon, Griffith allowed them the weekend off.
Lights! Needs about 20 minutes out of it.
The Kazan film, The Last Tycoon, had a wonderful scene. It was obviously the story of Irving Thalberg. And I always took that as a wonderful metaphor about the editing process, that it's silent, it's anonymous.
What's that, are you asleep? Jesus. Goddamn movie even puts the editor to sleep.
He's not asleep, Mr. Brady.
What do you mean he's not asleep?
He's dead, Mr. Brady.
Dead? What do you mean he's dead?
He must have died during...
He's dead. We were just watching the rough cut. Jesus, I didn't hear anything. Did you hear anything?
Not a thing.
Eddie, he probably didn't want to disturb the screening, Mr. Brady.
Today, not only is the editor still alive, but he has become the director's key collaborator. No other crew member spends as much time working alone with the director.
Finding the relationship with the editor is like trying to decide whether or not to get married. Because if the marriage isn't a good one, it's going to be a sticky divorce.
When I was doing my first movie, the only thing I knew is I wanted a female editor. Because I just felt a female editor would be more nurturing to the movie and to me. I wouldn't try to be winning their way just to win their way, all right? They wouldn't be trying to shove their agenda or win their battles with me. They would be nurturing me through this process.
Give me in! She killed me, man! You fucking got that! Hey!
I think editors play a big role with directors in giving them support, making them feel like they can look at something that may have trouble or problems and be comfortable enough so that they can approach those problems.
Hi, Vincent. I'm getting dressed.
In the beginning, he really doesn't guide me. And then I put together what I think he wants. And pretty much we've worked together so long I can judge what he would want.
The fuck is this place?
This is Jack Rabbit Slim's. An Elvis man should love it.
Come on, man, let's go get a steak.
You can get a steak here, Daddy-O. Don't be a...
Oh, after you, kitty cat.
Initially, I had it like really long. It was like a date in real time, all right? And it was sort of like Sally's job to kind of like, little by little convince me to bring it down and bring it down and bring it down. And it still could be funny. You would still have what I'm talking about, but maybe it wouldn't be so painful.
He did want it to feel very much like a date, and it was very long at first, and we just had to kind of live with it for a while.
Just like, letting me live with it long enough so I could eventually, okay, I've had it enough. I've seen that enough. Okay, maybe now I can lose this part. Okay, so now it was like here and now it's like here.
Finally, we'd bring it down, and then I kind of brought it too far down, and then he said, we got to bring it back out.
That's it. No more. This is not a video.
We do that for 8 months. So intense. I see him more than my husband.
And sometimes I, get annoyed with her for not reading my mind 100%. I mean, all right, it's not good enough that she reads it 80% of the time, all right?
We work very intensely together, and it's kind of amazing that we still like each other. If I was with my husband that long, I don't think I'd like him that much. So
by the time I've thought of an idea, written it, found the financing, cast the film, directed it, I get to the cutting room and it's like I've washed up on shore because I'm so happy to be there, because then I think, now we can start making the film.
It's so hard to be a director, and it's hard on the set. By the time they come into the cutting room the first week, they're usually half the people they were when they started out. They're shells of the people they were. And at least in my cutting room, I try to make it very easygoing and try to heal them back into shape so that they can get to work on the movie.
When Matthew Broderick is busted from having thrown the election, he enters the principal's office and sees all the people gathered there who know he's guilty.
Mr. McAllister, I hope you can help us clear something up.
He wanted to cut it like the end sequence of The Good and the Bad and the Ugly, with holding on the faces for a really long time with this swelling music. I was like, no, let's cut it really fast and build to a climax.
And I didn't want to do that. I thought it was cheesy and would call too much attention to itself.
And he just wouldn't want to do it. He wouldn't want to put it in the movie like that. So finally I said, I'll pay you $25.
And I said, no, let's not do that.
I go, okay, 50.
And I said, no.
He's like, no.
And I said, 75.
So he even gave me an invoice, and it says I owe him $75. So I paid him $75 to cut it in. And that's how it is now.
There's a mismatch here, and I'm going to have to determine whether this is a problem or not, because Brown is looking toward camera, but when we cut, he's looking up off to the left. We can have Jeremy come in and cut so that Jeremy's head is masking Brown's head, so that the mismatch is not seen. And now I'm going to mark this frame, and I'm going to get rid of this area, which is 1, 2, 3 frames. And now I'm going to look at it in context and see how it looks. Good. You have to have the personality that enjoys that. It's almost like making little pieces of jewelry, that patience of the individual shots and how they're crafted together. But at the same time, you have to have an appreciation for the larger picture and how these shots fit into the larger picture of the scene, and then how the scene fits into the larger picture of the sequence, and how the sequence fits together with the larger picture of the whole work, and then how the work fits together with society. So it's a boxes within boxes within boxes.
The Russian Revolution sparked a revolution in film editing as well.
The crazy Russians started fucking around with images, all right, and juxtaposing them and creating different emotional effects.
Lenin saw film as the perfect medium to inspire his largely illiterate nation to join the revolution.
They took these films out in the middle of farmlands and showed it to the farmers and the peasants. They began to understand that they could get a certain emotional, psychological effect by a certain type of cutting from one image to the next. And that became a manipulation of what the audience was feeling.
The Russian filmmakers rejected the bourgeois stories and seamless editing practiced by Griffith. Instead of melodrama, they offered real life. To make the film Man with a Movie Camera, documentary filmmaker Dziga Vertov and his team took his cameras into the streets to record a typical day in Moscow.
It's constantly reminding me that I'm watching a movie. There are scenes inside an editing room. You see how they edited movies back in 1929. They were engaged in a pure explosion of creative activity in manipulating these images. Every modern editing convention that we know of is demonstrated in Man with a Movie Camera.
The film celebrated not just the revolution, but the role of the cameraman and the editor in helping to create it. Vertov and his wife Elizaveta cut their documentaries and newsreels in dark basements with rats scuttling underfoot. But in this film, he made the editor as important as any other worker in the revolution. The theoretician Lev Kuleshov also experimented with film editing. In his most famous study, he took a shot of a Russian actor and intercut it with 3 different objects: a bowl of hot soup, a distraught woman draped across her husband's coffin, and a little girl playing with a teddy bear. When audiences saw the film, they raved about the actor's performance. How hungrily he looked at the soup. How sorrowfully he gazed at the woman. And how tenderly he watched the little girl.
But actually, it was the same expression each time. Now, this demonstrates the power of juxtaposition, the power of montage, by taking one shot and another shot to give it a third meaning. And the third meaning is an effect, an emotion that's much greater than the sum total of the 2 parts that put it together in the first place. And this is the basis of all editing, by the way.
One of Kuleshov's contemporaries, Sergei Eisenstein, combined these experiments with Marxist ideology to create films of revolutionary fervor. He saw editing like history, as a clash of images and ideas. The meaning of the film was not in the shots themselves, but in their collision. When 2 elements are in conflict, he argued, their collision sparks a new meaning of higher order. Where Griffith tried to hide his cuts, Eisenstein reveled in them. He wanted the audience to feel the frame, to know that this is a movie, not life.
Eisenstein is the first real director. He killed himself in his staging and he killed himself with his camera work and everything, but it was all at the service of the scissors. Every little single solitary bit of it.
I got a movie projector when I was like 11, and one of the first movies I got was Battleship Potemkin. I just ran that Odessa step sequence over and over again. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. One of the things that makes it incredible is the editing, the incredible juxtaposition of images. What the Russians did was a response to what Griffith had done. Classical editing and now Eisensteinian montage, then you can take that further. The American cinema has absorbed all of that stuff from the Russians, and now it's in our films. The fact is that many of these techniques have been appropriated into what we do every day as editors, right here in Hollywood, California, making action pictures. Because we are also trying to get a response from the audience. We are also trying to get them to rise out of their seats, rise out of their complacency, but not necessarily for revolutionary purposes, but just to really have a great time in the movies.
You've got suspense and you've got action, and I've found a good combination in the two Terminator films was to have a suspenseful build-up to an action release. In Terminator 2, you have a slow, tense build-up of these characters moving around, closing in on the young John Connor, and then he sees the Terminator for the first time, and it's all in slow motion. And I like to use the slow motion in the build-up, where it has this kind of protracted, dreamlike or nightmarish quality, and then there's a cathartic break, and then it kicks into gear.
Get down.
Chase, something is going right or something is going wrong, and you want to accentuate that. Rhythm is one of the ways you do that. You also want to create peaks and valleys in terms of rhythm.
Chases are a wonderful thing to work on as an editor. I wouldn't want to do them as a steady diet, but every now and then it's great fun. My favorite chase that I've ever worked on, actually, was the canal chase, as we called it, in Terminator 2.
Our ancestors were survivors, therefore we're here. And so there's something plugged into our reptilian hindbrain that makes us relate to the idea of being pursued and getting away. So we get to go through these kind of cathartic simulator runs when we watch a movie, and we get to experience that heart-pounding fear of being chased.
It's a natural form of excitement. Editing can hone that, sharpen that. The tempo of the cuts, the variety of shots that are used, the changing image sizes of characters, reactions, eyes. All these things are in the palette. By manipulation and juxtaposition, you can increase the excitement.
In the 1930s, movies became an even bigger business. The movie studios introduced sound films and radically reshaped movie making. Hollywood retooled itself on the model of the factory assembly line. The studios cranked out movies with almost the same speed that Henry Ford mass-produced cars. I don't want it good, Jack Warner declared. I want it Tuesday.
You now needed an industrial system to make this all work. In the first 20, 25, 30 years of cinema, large numbers of editors were women. It was considered to be a woman's job because it was something like knitting, it was something like tapestry, sewing, that you took these pieces of fabric, which is what film are, and you put them together. It was when sound came in that the men began to infiltrate the ranks of the editors, because sound was somehow electrical, it was technical, it was no longer knitting.
The advent of sound expanded the editor's role in Hollywood. During the 30s and 40s, directors rarely came into the cutting room. The editing was controlled by the studios and their supervising editors. One of the most powerful was Margaret Booth, supervising editor at MGM for 30 years. Mastering the transition to sound, she caught the attention of legendary producer Irving Thalberg, who was the first to call cutters film editors, starting with Booth herself.
She oversaw all the production and had a say in almost everyone. But Maggie was probably the toughest and most feared woman at MGM. I mean, people would shudder when they hear that she was on the phone, or she'd bust into the editing room, or you'd get a call, come down to room F, which is her room. You'd think, oh God, what have I done now? Margaret would tell the editors, it's your responsibility for the pace of the movie, it's your responsibility to get the best performances out of your actors, it's your responsibility to make it as good as you can. Margaret Booth, she used to say, if I feel there's a cut at a certain spot, whether it matches or not, cut. And you cut, he says, for the emotion. And if you will get away with so much by doing that. And I would hear her really yell at different editors who would say, oh, it doesn't match. She said, I don't care. You know, cut.
Booth, like other great studio editors of the era, helped create many of the stars of the golden age of Hollywood. Editors today are still doing the same.
We totally control the performance of an actor in the cutting room, actually. A lot of them won't admit that.
Most actors learn very early on that the editor is the one to make friends with, because their performance depends a great deal on the editor and the taste and the talent of the editor.
We'll see dailies, and take 5 is spectacular. It is great. But there's also something wonderful in take 7 and take 4 and take 3. Sometimes those and an actor will see it on screen and say, wow, that was terrific. You used take 5. They don't know, they don't realize that you are borrowing from every single performance. And the editor is the person who's responsible for finding those moments in each performance.
You talk about basic instinct. I think to a large degree, the great performance that Sharon is giving there is also constructed by Frank. He spent an enormous amount of time in selecting every part of every take that he felt was important.
In cutting the interrogation sequence, using the basic scenes that were back and forth from the dialogue, the scene would be fairly dull.
What are you going to do?
I had to create her looks and his looks. They were manufactured. They weren't really shot that way. I would take a piece of Michael looking at her from a different part of the scene and a piece of her looking at him from a different part of the scene.
I don't make any rules, Nick. I go with the flow.
Sharon asked if she could see it, and I said, yeah, it's done.
And Sharon came upstairs and said, you must remove that scene. And I said, what scene? And she said, you know the scene in the interrogation.
But they were all afraid, I think, that these shots would hurt her performance. And even Sharon, I think, still thinks now that she lost the Oscar nomination because of these shots.
And I said, Sharon, that scene is going to make you a star. And Paul said to her,
you shot it, you know what I was doing, and basically I like it. And it works.
And then, that's history.
I always find the editor has more objectivity than the director, because the editor wasn't on the set. The editor didn't cast the movie. The editor didn't do the storyboards. The editor didn't inundate him or herself with a year and a half of pre-production. So the editor is has the most objective eye in that creative environment.
I remember one night, I go over to Steven's house in Poland. I said, Steve, I want to run this scene for you. And he says, he's okay. And I run the scene. He looks at me. He says, I'll see you in the morning. He walked out. He was so emotionally involved with the scene. He couldn't believe that he shot it. It was so real. We were all terribly affected by the film. There's something inside that takes over. When it's very emotional, when there are problems in people's lives, something emotional takes over that's beyond your conscious mind. And it seemed like an extreme example, but when you're editing that kind of film, you have to disassociate. You have to see each thing as a scene, and you build a scene and do the best you can with each scene. And then when it melds together, that's when you get the full force.
I think the scene in Schindler's List really illustrates the importance of emotion through film editing. It's the scene where they have a drink together, the first drink they've shared, because Stern has refused to drink with Schindler until this moment. There is just a pacing that is so emotional for me, so profoundly, deeply felt.
Someday, this is all going to end, you know. I was going to say we'll have a drink then.
I think I better have it now.
Mike Kahn's choices of how long to let the characters look at each other and study each other and think about how they're feeling, that was all done in the editing room. It wasn't in the script, and it wasn't on the floor the day I shot it. That whole emotional kind of meeting of the minds between those two great men happened in the editing room.
In dialogue scenes, I like people looking at each other. I like eyes to meet. So they're getting into each other and you're connecting.
Another way of looking at film editing is that it's a dance of eyes. Philip Seymour Hoffman's eye is looking. And that's a good thing. Now let's cut to a close-up of Hoffman looking, and the close-up of Hoffman is here. We've never seen this angle before, so the brain has to figure out what it's looking at and maybe why it's looking at it. And to the degree that you hold shots a certain length, you allow a certain train of thoughts to happen. When you cut a shot off, you've also cut off the thinking about that shot. Now, we want to cut to what he sees, because that's how we're going to understand what he's thinking about. Now there you see him thinking, and then his eye goes down. So we run that at speed. Flinch, point of view, thinking, other co-conspirator. Let's do it now. What? Let's go. Oh, something's up. Let's go. Don't do it. And we go. There's something about film, because of its sensory completeness, the fact that it is sound and image in this powerful fusion, that gets at something very deep within us.
Filmmakers realized that sound and image didn't just stimulate emotions, they could also influence beliefs. During World War II, the U.S. government enlisted Hollywood's best. Editors and directors brought with them the same techniques they had used in fiction films to stir audiences across America. The Hollywood recruits applied their skill to American propaganda films, such as Why We Fight. Both German and American political leaders recognized how powerfully sound and picture can manipulate audiences. One of the most infamous examples of film used for political propaganda was Triumph of the Will. Director Leni Riefenstahl used sound, music, and masterful editing to make Adolf Hitler into a god.
In uns marschiert Deutschland und hinter uns kommt Deutschland!
When the Allies went to war against Germany, British editor Charles Ridley re-edited the same footage to turn Hitler into a fool. Whether used for propaganda or entertainment, these techniques showed how powerfully editing could shape hearts and minds.
The manipulation of the elements within a film is a very powerful thing. It's almost a sacred thing in a way, because you're creating effects, you're creating responses in the audience.
Editing is manipulation. We're manipulating reality as the audience sees it, because you want the audience to respond in a certain way. Whether it's a laugh, or a sigh, or a fright, everything's manipulated. And some people say, well, this director, he's manipulated the audience. Well, that's so naive, because that's all we do is manipulate.
After World War II, Hollywood continued to make movies in the same way it had before the war. Although editors were now unionized, they were viewed for the most part as highly skilled mechanics.
There was a man named Owen Marks. He edited The Petrified Forest, Casablanca, Treasure of Sierra Madre, East of Eden, and his films are immortal, and the man is completely unknown. And it's sort of symbolic of the way editors have been ignored in the literature about Hollywood.
Editors worked on cutter's row and were expected to conform to the established rules of editing.
If we were to think about the films that were being made, there was a certain film language that was very, very distinct. Certain kinds of coverage, long shot, two shot, single. There was almost a formulaic way of presenting films. This film language was very strict. And in editorial terms, there were rules that one felt could not be broken.
A master shot had to come first, and then if you had an over-shoulder, you went to the over-shoulder, and you never went to the close-up.
The thing you've got to remember is that a gentleman you meet among the cold cuts is simply not as attractive as one that you meet, say, in the mink department at Bergdorf's.
In the 40s and 50s,
The audience would expect the character to drive up, show him getting out of the car, he would walk up to the building, and then he would open the door, and then the editor would match cut the door opening on the other side, and he would walk in and come over and sit down.
Pull up the chair. Thanks.
It just seemed to me absolutely stupid that you had to show somebody coming down the stairs and all the way across the road and up the other side. I mean, you knew that they were coming from here and they were going to there. Why couldn't you just cut directly?
Oh là là, Michel?
Je peux entrer?
Oui.
In France, a group of film critics turned directors also challenged the doctrine of invisible editing and launched a revolution among editors.
When I first saw the French Nouvelle Vague, I instantly loved it. I loved the idea. I loved the way they edited and thought I would like to cut like that.
J'aime une fille qui a une très jolie nuque, de très jolis seins, une très jolie voix, de très jolis poignets, un très joli front, de très jolis genoux.
You know, Godard used jump cuts because it was like, well, why not? You know, there's nothing interesting happening in this middle part, so let's just go to a jump cut.
When I saw Breathless, I was staggered at Godard's brutality.
What they brought to editing was a breaking of the rules. Whatever books that said this is how it had to be done, they burned them.
Breathless is too hip for me. I come from Lower East Side. I'm an Italian-American guy. It's too beatnik. It's like, you know, bohemian. It's too cool. I liked it. I don't know what the hell was happening in it.
Tu crois qu'il va me doubler, celui-là? Avec sa frégate à la con?
You know, when I first saw Breathless in the 60s, it's like, wow. I mean, just in the first 5-minute sequence in introducing Jean-Paul Belmondo's character as this petty thief, I mean, every rule was violated in terms of how long to hold a shot, the discontinuity of what was going on. Even screen directions, you know, were mixed in. And I felt like either this guy doesn't know what he's doing, or he's so confident that he has the grammar of film down that he's trying to show us a new way to use the material he has to tell the story.
There were some films that really changed our perception of what filmmaking was, and certainly it affected what editing was. I mean, I think one of those seminal films is certainly something like Bonnie and Clyde.
Some people say I broke those rules first. I certainly did not. I mean, the Russians broke those rules, and the Germans broke those rules. This was nothing new, but it was new for Hollywood.
Several editors have had big impacts on me, have influenced my thinking. Dede Allen certainly is one who has taught me that don't be afraid to take a chance on doing something that doesn't seem like it's going to work. When Beatty and Faye Dunaway get to know each other, they're standing on the street corner and she says, "I don't believe you robbed banks." And he said, "Yes, I do. Look at my gun." And he pulls it out and holds it to her on the street corner. And that could easily have been done with the tilt down to the gun, the pan over to her hands fidgeting with a Coke bottle, up to her face. But it was done in her eyes look from him down, gun, back to him. It keeps you on edge. There's the excitement, there's the danger, there's the eroticism in not being able to fully get every moment because you're cutting it off and you are not allowing the moment to come to fruition.
Bonnie and Clyde was much more violent than anything we'd done because basically the Americans like violence much more than we do.
Well, it was shot in so many wonderful ways because this is the scene that Arthur intended to be cut in this fashion. The fact that it was so beautifully executed right from the very first cut. Jerry Greenberg was my assistant, and on the last scene, I left Jerry alone with that scene, and he did all the primary editing on that. All I did was tighten it later.
So they're going up, trying to get away from him before he catches them. Then the cavalry come around the corner. In the end, there will be probably 5,000 shots in the film, and all of them have to be ultimately be the right shot in the right place for the right length of time.
Another change in editing is the accelerated pace of movies, a subject of controversy among filmmakers.
An encounter with two swords 30 years ago would have been probably done in a master shot and a couple of exchanges. Today, that encounter could evolve into 200 shots. Split second, eye blink,
a blade going into a chest, slight movement of a wrist. So the audience is taken right down into this roller coaster ride of minutiae, and that's what they want.
Because kids today are raised on television and in MTV and commercials, they not only can process information faster and understand what images mean, but that they demand it.
And I mean, fast cutting was not invented now or with MTV. Just look at Lou Lombardo's work on The Wild Bunch.
Sometimes a cutting style is effective inside of a movie to shake you up and rattle your soul, but consistently to have that style pounding away at you like a metronome on high speed for 2.5 hours is a little bit, at least for me, maybe I'm just getting old, but it's a little bit debilitating. Now, it doesn't bother my kids, because my kids were raised on 30-second commercials and on MTV and VH1, and they were raised on video games.
I feel like I was born 80 and I'm growing backwards. So now I'm somewhere around 27, I get a tattoo, and I'm feeling closer to a generation that has learned to absorb information at a speed that was heretofore unthinkable, and where their rhythms are well more hungry than a traditional narrative pace.
What I'm afraid of is the tendency for everything to go by quickly. And I'm afraid of what it does to the culture. A sense of consuming something and throwing it away, as opposed to being enveloped with something. Taking the time to see and experience time in a different way.
First, one understands that he causes much of his own suffering needlessly. Second, he looks for the reasons for this in his own life. To look is to have confidence in one's own ability to end the suffering. Finally, a wish arises to find a path to peace. For all beings desire happiness. All wish to find their purer selves.
In many ways, we're the last storyteller. The movie has been written by the writer, and then it's directed, and then it comes to the last storytelling, which is in the editing process.
The last draft of the screenplay is the first cut of the movie, and the final cut of the movie is the last draft of the script.
An editor can take a sequence that a director shot and reconfigure it in such a way that it becomes a whole different sequence, which is much more beneficial to the movie.
Obviously, great directors give you great material to work with, but the ultimate film that you see is the edited version, and it's the editor is greatly responsible for that.
I find my work absolutely fascinating and absorbing. I sat down to work, and 30 years went by without my noticing it.
It's true. When I go into an editing room in the morning, I edit. My assistant has to remind me it's lunchtime. Or Steven has to come in and say, hey, Mike, why don't you stop for a while or something? Because time goes by like that. You're building a whole other world. You're building a whole construct.
There's a joy on one level in that it's very much like putting a puzzle together. I have thousands and thousands of pieces, and how do I tell the story? And this goes before that, no, that doesn't. Or actually, I only need half of that.
The job is not unlike the Talmudic scholar who goes and sits and argues about the book over and over again, always coming up with new answers that are just more subtly refined than the last answer.
To sit in the theater at a preview and to hear an audience laugh at that moment when you expect to laugh and it comes back at you, or to hear an audience shuffling and crying because it's so sad and you expect that moment to really happen that way, that's so marvelous. It tells you what power we have.
I believe in people's being able to learn, because otherwise, what's the point? We're all going to, be past one of these days. And how are we going to take this fantastic thing called film and motion pictures and storytelling unless we pass it on and teach people how to do it?
In the century since Edwin Porter introduced editing, editors have emerged from their dimly lit back rooms. Once anonymous men and women, they have gradually become principal collaborators in the filmmaking process. The best-kept secret in the movies, the editor, is finally out.
The Oscar goes to...
Thank you. Thank you so much. You know, Stephen gave me my my first editorial advice. I don't know if you remember this or not, Stephen, but Stephen produced I Want to Hold Your Hand, my first movie, so talked to him about a lot of things, but when it came to editing, he said, "Hey, Bob, real easy. When in doubt, cut it out." And I've been saying that in the editing room, as you guys know, for all these years. Stephen also was able to, when I was making that movie, Stephen just bought like his first mansion in Beverly Hills. And he said, "Hey, I got this great pool house. And you guys don't have to edit on the lot where there's no windows in the editing rooms. You guys can edit in this pool house." And we said, "Hey, that's great." So we went in the back of Stephen's house and we were editing I Want to Hold Your Hand in the pool house. But the strange thing kept happening. We'd get there in the morning and the editors would pull the reels off the racks and all the sprockets would be torn up and there'd be like ripped film. And of course, you don't have to, think very far to figure out what was really happening. So I asked Stephen about it one day, and he said, "Well, sometimes I can't sleep, and so I thought I'd go up to the pool house and run a few reels."
But what happens in any room? You sit around, you talk about girls, and you talk dirty, and you lie on the couch, and you enjoy yourself, and you eat chocolate bars. And like I said before, when somebody hears a director coming, you throw everything away, just stand up straight like you're working and you're doing everything. And that's what editors do.